So, welcome everybody today to our webinar. Today's program is Advancing Community Broadband, brought to you by the University of Illinois Extension. My name is Mike Delaney, and I'm an Extension Community and Economic Development educator based here in Northern Illinois in Ogle County. We are delighted today to welcome Dr. Keith Taylor, who is an associate professor of cooperative extension and community economic development from the University of California, Davis, UC Davis. He's an Illinois boy, and with that, I'm going to allow him to share his bona fides with everybody. Keith, welcome, and the microphone is yours.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate you all having me here. It's good to be back in Illinois from a distance in California. For those of you that don't know, I'm from Mattoon, Illinois. It's always fun. When I'm in California, I tell people I'm from Mattoon. They're like, Mattoon? I'm like, no, you got to say it right. It's Mattoon, Illinois. So I got my master's degree at University of Illinois Springfield. I got my PhD at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And I got hired in California in 2017 to be a professor of cooperative extension and community economic development. This is me enjoying my time in Monterey. I like to say I have the best professor gig in the world. I essentially get paid to travel around California and to work directly with community stakeholders. So it's just this really privileged job that I have, getting to explore this other part of the country I haven't gotten to see. But I really appreciate working with Nancy and Mike on getting this platform, because I'm wanting to continue working in the Midwest. This is home for me. And I want to bring these cool things we're doing from California to Illinois. And likewise, there's tons of Midwest innovations that we need to bring out to California. So with that, I'll hop right into it. In the work that I do, I'm really inspired thinking about how it is we could do community economic development beyond just big business and beyond just big government. It's not to reject these approaches, but it's to say there's this whole big area of civil society that we're not digging into, and there's all kinds of cool innovations and approaches. So with that, I've been working pretty in depth with the American cooperative sector, specifically the electric cooperatives, and I'll get around to why that is. But for today's topic, we're interested in how we can drive 100% broadband access. This is a really important topic because we're going through the fourth industrial revolution right now. All of our devices connect to the internet, it seems. We have the rise of the platform economy. All of us have these devices here, like our iPhones. And of course, there's AI that's really on the scene. And AI is changing a lot of our rural communities in ways that I don't think people are perceiving. A lot of the server farms are being sited in our rural areas. A lot of that is because the rural utilities work quite well with server farms and siting them in those communities. Now, why is it important that beyond competing in the fourth industrial revolution that our rural communities have access to broadband? And there's these obvious things here. This is pulled from the book Farm Fresh Broadband by Ali. He talks about how broadband enhances economic development through these 5 pillars. It's economic development, education, health, civic engagement, quality of life. And the problem is rural communities are stranded in this conversation, though. Even with a lot of the federal dollars that are being put out there to grow rural broadband, a lot of communities are not yet prepared and in order to use these monies to grow their local ISPs. And they're lacking strategies. They don't know who to tap into or who to reach out to work with to grow their local ISPs. This is a problem because these monies will eventually go away. So while the money is there, these rural communities need to take advantage of that. The data is pretty clear, too, that rural America is being left behind. There's places where there's just no internet accessible in the United States altogether. I'll tell you, when I go to rural California, I've been surprised because Illinois has its fair share of pretty rural places. And there's places in Illinois that aren't served. California has some of the most isolated rural trains I've been in my entire life. And that's something you don't expect when you come out to California. So it's really strange and a little bit off-putting when you go into these beautiful areas and your cell phone's not connecting to cell phone towers. You feel like you're vulnerable. You feel like if you're stranded somewhere, you're not going to be able to get assistance. Imagine living in these places under those circumstances, especially with a lot of the climate threats we have and various climate emergencies that can occur due to weather events. There's also this divergence that's occurring too between rural and metropolitan regions because of the access to the internet. Metropolitan areas are able to thrive and compete in this globalized economy, but rural communities not so much in many ways if they don't have access to broadband. In California, state of 40 million people, 1 in 5 people lack broadband access. And in this research I've been doing, I've been focusing largely in California, but it's within the national context. So just to say, this is why I don't have Illinois numbers here. But recent federal and state investments are pretty significant. Federal dollars, about over $42 billion. In California, when we had our budget surpluses, we hit $6 billion in investments in middle mile and last mile. The middle mile thing is something I want to come back and talk to at the very end of this in Q&A, and I hope Mike will tee me up on that. But here's something that's a little factoid for those of you that aren't aware. The federal government has actually put in over $100 billion in growing rural broadband over the decades. There's a good question, like, where the heck did all that money go? Pick up Ali's book, Firm Fresh Broadband, to find out. But let's just say some of the actors that you might suspect have not been using the money as robustly as you might expect. But what this means is with the monies that are coming out and the monies that are available and the appetite to grow this, we need a last mile strategy. I told you that I've been involved with the National Rural Electric Co-op system. I've worked in depth in California, in Illinois, in Indiana, Minnesota, and South Carolina with those electric cooperatives. It's been pretty remarkable, too, to see what sort of innovations are doing in the electric utility space, but also the broadband space. So to tease up that, the question that I have in the research I've been doing is, what insights do rural electric cooperatives provide for overcoming policy and competitive obstacles to provide broadband in geographically and economically challenged communities? My argument is that looking at what rural communities do to overcome these challenges can also inform our marginalized urban areas as well. So I'll give a little background on why these communities have been left behind. My findings are there's a misaligned institutional fit. We have public policies that encourage one kind of business, for profit, investor owned, when we need another kind, cooperative, community, not for profit. We have an over reliance on these unregulated investor owned utilities whose explicit priorities are profit. And that's fine. But we just need to acknowledge that their priorities are profit and not meeting the needs of our rural residents. I'll give a little background on how and why electric costs became leaders in rural broadband provision. And I'll give 2 case studies following up by discussion of the findings that I have and some Q&A with folks. And Mike, just so you know, I do see there's a little bit of a chat. There might be a chat there. I probably won't be paying attention to that. So if you want to key me up as someone asks a question in the chat, I'll definitely address that. So a little bit of why it is that our policies are the way they are with regard to privileging investor-owned firms over nonprofits, co-ops, hybrids, and other types of firms. In our community economic development policies and strategies, we have 4 traditional economic development models. We do attraction and retention. So we try to bring in big companies that are going to employ a lot of folks, or we try to retain existing big businesses. We do workforce development, which I cynically say in the low road approach is, hey, you lost your job, you're 50 years old, time to go back to college. It's not really the most empowering approach in workforce development as I see it. Then we have small business development, and we have arts and culture. These approaches, I'm not rejecting them out of hand. I'm just saying that they're very narrow and we need to diversify them, especially against this restructuring that we're seeing in our economy. We're seeing this growing financialization. I was just at a conference where we were talking about growing ag tech, and venture capital was there. And they were talking about how they want to get these startups ready so they can have a 10x return when they get out of their investments in that. And if you know anything about the business of ag, you're not going to get that. But the problem is our financial economy is moving in such a way where a lot of our investment groups are saying we want those kind of returns. We need to recalibrate those expectations, especially with certain areas of the economy. We're also seeing a rolling up or conglomerating of certain sectors. We've seen that in the veterinary space. More recently, we've seen that in the home goods, space. And now there's a lot of conversation, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, about HVAC systems. Those are getting rolled up by private equity. Further, you have a lot of firms that are coming into our rural areas that are absentee controlled and they're metropolitan centric. So what this means is that we're degrading our local institutions. We're not supporting local economic development in our federal policy that's delegated down to the locals. And we have what my colleague Martin Kinney calls the demise of the local, or the loss of our capacity for public entrepreneurship and self-governance. It's a real problem for these rural communities. So now, how did telecommunications get into this space, become big leaders and go from a highly regulated telephone space to an unregulated broadband space? Well, it's sort of like what happened with the platform economy with things like Uber. Uber, when they came in, they said, you can't regulate us like the cab companies. We're not a cab company. We're a tech company. At the end of the day, we know they're a cab company. They just use technology. That was essentially the argument that a lot of the very well-regulated telcos made back in the day. So starting in the 90s, government policies did not regulate them like a traditional investor-owned utility. So this means that their universal service requirements under public utility commissions were not enforced. So they could go out and do what was called cream skimming. They picked the most profitable areas to go into, and then they left the lower profit areas. Now, something you'll hear often in this space from the investor-owned utilities is that we can't go into these rural areas because they won't, quote, pencil out. And when they say pencil out, I hear a lot of folks go, see, they're not making a profit. No, notice they don't say it's unprofitable. They say it doesn't pencil out. So what it means is they're going to have to forego their 20 to 25% profit margin in these urban areas and go down to a 2 to 7% profit margin in rural areas. In other words, it is perfectly profitable to go into rural areas. It's just not as lucrative as it is to be in metropolitan areas. So I like to say this is the empire striking back. These are these telcos that are sort of resentful that they had to be regulated in the 70s and 80s, and they had found a workaround to create an entirely new approach under regulation and have a nice high margin business line. So part of the reason why we don't have rural broadband building up is we have policy lock and industrial organizational impediments. And the system has largely been really opaque. If I go out and I talk to rural communities and I say, it's actually not as challenging to build a local ISP as you think, they get very intimidated because they think, wow, this is going to be a 10, 20, 30, $40 million spend in our local community. I don't want to be on the hook for something that seems complicated. So we need to make this system transparent and easy for people to access in order to build this out. Now, one of the other things that's a structural challenge for our rural communities is what Ali refers to in the literature as the rural penalty. A lot of our rural communities suffer from the tyranny of distance. They're far away from population centers or decision-making centers, such as Springfield. The geographic characteristics of a lot of our communities also make it challenging. I can tell you that in California, we have communities that are mountains, deserts, and almost rainforest-like all in one small area. It's really challenging to work within those confines. But Anza Electric Cooperative has done that, and I'll talk about that. And then there's our population characteristics too. A lot of our rural communities have persistent poverty. The workforce is relatively homogenous in terms of skill sets. So we need to work within those confines. But this is also combined with the idea that we beify these kind of private entrepreneurs or these profit-seeking folks that are going to come in to save us. We have to realize that, again, not to reject them, but to say that that's an incomplete approach to how we're going to do economic development in some of these areas. Remember, private entrepreneurs are seeking a profit exit. They want a high return on investment, and they want a business model that's best designed for metropolitan regions. This isn't what we need for our rural communities. So when you combine the rural penalty with the institutions that we fit on top of our rural communities, we end up with decay. We end up with an economy that's misaligned with rural needs. The logics of investment firms do not fit with rural economics. The entrepreneurial ecosystems for broadband compound the issue because, again, we're privileging investor-owned firms. And everyone suffers from this. It's not just rural communities. I mean, rural community self-development is impinged, but population centers are also impinged. They're also harmed. because a lot of our rural communities are sites of natural resource extraction and food production and these sort of things. So we need our rural communities to be vibrant and producing those things that help to drive the global economy. This means is we have this toolbox of all these tools, and we just keep reaching for 4 of them: the attraction, retention, workforce development, small business development, and arts and culture. We need to diversify this. Now, this is a visual from the Democracy Collaborative. It talks about how there's this spectrum of business models that are out there, and we tend to forget about this because going back to one of my heroes in academia, Eleanor Ostrom, she talks about how there's this diversity of institutions, but also this array of entrepreneurship from our local communities. We have policies that incentivize the growth of investor-owned firms, but don't really have policies that incentivize the growth of hybrid firms. Pretty wild if you think about it. Now, this is where I pivot over to the electric cooperatives. The funny thing for me, being in California, I like to joke around that I'm bringing Midwest innovations to California. If you look here at this map, where do we have energy democracy? You'd think California would have quite a bit of it with the rural electric cooperatives, but California only has 3. Places like Illinois, places like Indiana, places that California might turn its back to, have dozens of electric cooperatives. They actually have energy democracy. And for those of you that aren't aware of this sector is owned and governed by 42 million Americans. 8,000 of those are governors of these electric cooperatives through their board of directors, generates $42 billion a year in revenue. And they have this amazing entrepreneurial support system that developed over the decades. It's just an astounding system. And what's more is it creates additional community capacity. Just because you have the electric co-op does not mean that you just have an electric utility. They're also getting involved in economic development through the creation of high-paying jobs, but also through the assets they own and they place in those communities. I wrote a book called Governing the Wind Energy Commons that talks about the economic development impacts of these sites that are being put in our rural communities by the electric co-ops. But the electric co-ops also invest in economic development as well. So they're a really great kind of threefer in your community. They're providing all these goods and services, they're helping out with technological transfer, and they're involved in economic development. And you go back in the day, how these electric cooperatives were founded. It's this amazing piece of public policy that we've forgotten. The federal government provided low interest loans and technical support. And then they went out in these rural communities and worked with farmers to stand the system up. This is an actual image of an electric co-op being built. So in the 1930s, we supported this remarkable amount of public entrepreneurship. So we need to be thinking again in our economic development policies and practices, how do we enable collective action, diverse user-owned enterprise, new market entrants, community not-for-profit values, and public or social entrepreneurship? I apologize for the text being cruddy on here. I'll correct that when I send these slides out. So back to our question, what insights do these electric cooperatives provide us? Because up to now, I've just been talking about how the investor-owned utilities aren't providing broadband and there's electric co-ops. Cool. So what's the big deal? What are they doing? Well, first, let me get back to the latent public entrepreneurial capacity of the electric co-op system. What I think about is the electric co-ops provide a vision of what if instead of us waiting on someone else providing these things for us, what if we did it ourselves? What if we don't wait for people to save us? What if we do that for us? And again, that's where I come back to my book here, Governing the Wind Energy Commons, where I compared a cooperative wind farm versus a corporate-owned wind farm. I wanted to see if there was a community economic development differential, if it mattered who owned the wind energy. And what I found is it did, at least in those case studies. I don't have a statistical analysis to demonstrate anything, but I can tell you the case study provided a number of insights into how these electric cooperatives deliver on economic development in these rural communities. And in my field work that I've been doing since then, I see it time and time again, the electric co-ops deliver a lot more for their communities than investor-owned utilities. Now, why is it the electric co-ops provide this additional capacity? Well, they're predicated on these 7 cooperative principles and values. The investor-owned firm, it's he who has the most money, has the most voice. With a cooperative, it's one member, one vote. So it's more democratic. But also, the system is structured as such where if there's any profits, it either goes back into the system to make it better, or it goes to the ratepayers themselves in order to offset the cost. It's saying, hey, you paid too much for this good or service. Additionally, these co-ops are encouraged to cooperate amongst co-ops. That's why they form these federated systems so they can maintain local power, but then have economies of scale and scope along the way. And they're also designed to have concern for their community. So they do economic development. And in any general co-op, you have a number of stakeholders that can own a co-op. It can be consumers and citizens, small businesses, medium businesses, hybrid firms, even governments. And the way that they get economic might is through market power, collective buying power. They also get collective political power. A thing I like to point out is if you're in rural Montana in the middle of nowhere, you could be a member of your rural electric co-op. That rural electric co-op could be a member of the state association, and it could be a member of the national association. This means that as a rural resident, you can have a national voice. Pretty remarkable stuff, and super empowering when you think about kind of our partisanship and the divides that we have in our economy, in our political system. You think instead of us fixating on electoral politics all the time, what if we started diversifying what we did in our communities and started standing up these industrial systems of cooperative ownership? Globally, the scale of the sector is huge. 1 billion people, 150 countries, 100 million jobs. This is a map on the left from the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Center for Cooperatives. You can see the distribution of cooperatives around the United States. They're in your backyard, right? And then if you look here too, on the right-hand side, there's all these community assets that are out there in these hybrid firms. Everything from ESOPs, hospitals, universities, community investment institutions, and co-ops. This number in co-ops is actually a little lower than what it looks like today. It's estimated today that the co-op sector has assets exceeding $6 trillion. It's a very large sector. And in the United States, 1 in 3 Americans is a member of a co-op. I'm sure many of you are members of REI, of a food cooperative, of a credit union. Maybe you're served by an electric co-op. It turns out co-ops are everywhere. More recently, there's been conversations around homeowners insurance in the news. A lot of insurance companies are mutuals, which essentially means they're co-ops. There's 65,000 cooperatives in the United States. A significant amount of this goes through agriculture. And of course, there's a lot of this in the utility space as well. And here's a number of brands that y'all might recognize. These are some very kind of household name brands. Ace Hardware is something I think that a lot of us, especially in rural communities, go to quite a bit. The local small businesses own that the franchise. So instead of the franchise being owned by the shareholders, it's the businesses themselves. So back to the question, what insights do the electric co-ops provide to us on broadband provision? I set out to do 2 different case studies. I wanted to have something in California, and then I wanted to have something that was far flung in the United States. And it turns out I had these great connections with the South Carolina electric cooperatives. So I did a comparative case study between Carolina Connect and Anza Electric Cooperative, which is outside of Palm Springs in California. Carolina Connect, I'll just briefly tell you about them. There's 3 electric cooperatives in South Carolina that were upgrading their energy infrastructure. So they're getting ready for renewables, they're getting ready for household solar, batteries, EVs, all these sort of things. And the one thing that you don't hear about from a lot of utilities is that as they upgrade their electric infrastructure, they need to run fiber so they have 2-way communication. And these electric co-ops were saying, this is going to double our asset base. This is a really pricey thing to get involved in. What if we lit up the fiber and provided high-speed fiber optic to the home for our members? And they really wanted to do it, but they were concerned that it would change the culture of their electric utility. So instead of doing this in-house, what they did is they created a nonprofit that sits over the 3 electric co-ops, and they contracted out the fiber to Carolina Connect. Now what you have is a nonprofit provider of high-speed broadband in South Carolina. And I believe that, I've got the numbers right here. They've increased the speed since I pulled down this visual here, but they were baseline 350 megabit up and down at $50 a month in rural South Carolina. Pretty impressive stuff. Now, I think they've increased it to 600 megabit, but I could be wrong. But when they increased it, they did not increase the price. And they did that on purpose because they wanted the members to call them up. And when the members called, they said, how dare you increase my rates? Carolina Connect said, we didn't increase your rates. We increased your speed. Because we're a nonprofit, we're keeping your rates constrained. So really cool story. the electric cooperatives are very happy with this arrangement. They've been able to offset the cost of their fiber optics in their areas. And it turns out if you look at websites like Nextdoor, people want to move to homes that are served by Carolina Connect. It just has such a great name brand. It's delivering a lot of fantastic services to folks and allows folks to be able to work from home, to play in the global economy from isolated rural parts of South Carolina. So the story that I'm really passionate about, though, is the Anza Electric Cooperative. I just absolutely love these folks and what they've done. Since I got out to California, I've been collaborating with them quite a bit. They get a little frustrated because they're in this isolated part, even though they're outside of Palm Springs, the state legislature does not pay attention to all the amazing things that they're doing. Because one of the things in California that I was a little surprised with is just how metropolitan the state legislature is. They're getting better about paying attention to rural areas, but just like maybe Illinois can be sometimes, California is a little bit more extreme with not focusing on rural. So we need to create platforms to get the message out. And I've been doing that through the UC system on what the electric co-ops are doing in California. But show you here. Anza Electric Cooperative right now provides minimum 100 megabit internet up and down $50 a month. They go up to 1 gigabit currently, but once the governor's middle mile investments come through, they're going to be able to provide for $50 a month, 1 gigabit minimum broadband in isolated rural California. So Anza Electric Cooperative is going to have South Korea style broadband in rural California. It's just absolutely amazing stuff. And to give you an idea, I mean, this is a visual. This is where I was at in doing my field work and some documentary work, which, by the way, at the end of the presentation, I'll have a QR code that you can scan with your phones and bring up a 22-minute documentary I did about Anza Electric Cooperative. This is me at Anza Electric Cooperative. You can see the sign here. I loved it. This is the original sign from the 1950s. And it's sort of a signifier of how far Anza has come. When they brought in the current general manager in the 2000s, he was sitting on infrastructure that had not been updated since the 1950s. And he's going, oh man, we've got to upgrade the grid for our consumer demands. California has these climate targets. What are we going to do? We're super low margin. We're anywhere from 1% to 7%. How are we going to pull this off? And it turned out that broadband was key in this. They had to do things like upgrade their substation. This is the modern substation I took from being in a pole bucket, in a bucket truck from way up high. It used to be a wood structure. That was the kind of things that needed to update there. And then they also added a microgrid on top of that. So I think it's interesting. California, we have one particular very large investor-owned utility that says we can't do microgrids. Here's this tiny little rural electric cooperative that is doing a microgrid out in the middle of nowhere. And they're able to light up the downtown during a power shutoff event for 8 hours with battery backup, powered fully by solar. And their goal, by the way, in the next few years is to go 100% locally generated renewable. So they can actually be off grid if they need to be. Ambitious little co-op. And they're doing this because they have a strategy that's leveraging their broadband infrastructure. This is their team. They have 2 people basically that are running their broadband operations. It's getting it out to rural California. I think they have 5,500 households they're serving. When I went there, and you'll see this in the documentary, I said to Sean, the guy on the left, can you show me what the middle mile internet looks like? He's like, yeah, come over here. And he opened up a closet and he points to a wire and he said, see that? I'm like, yeah. He goes, that's the internet. I'm like, how does it get out to the households? He points to a server rack and he said, see that? I'm like, yeah. He goes, those are 5,000 households. Goes out over the lines. Pretty easy. And it was just amazing how readily he was able to demystify these things. He's able to talk about what contracts you need to go and get, what kind of arrangements and supports there are in the electric co-op system to help them stand this up. In other words, they didn't do this on their own. They didn't do this through grit and determination. They did this because they had an amazing electric co-op system to back them up, and it made economic sense. They said that their broadband system is actually a better line of business than their electric system, which I think is just absolutely astounding and something you don't hear about. But when you start taking these 2 stories in mind with Carolina Connect and Anza Electric Co-op, you start seeing a whole bunch of tools in our toolbox that we're not leveraging. So I'll get to that. So how do we overcome this digital divide through this public entrepreneurship and using hybrid enterprise? So just because I've been talking about electric cooperatives, it doesn't mean that if you're not served by an electric co-op, you're out of luck. You have other options in order to get broadband in your area. So first, what cooperatives provide insights into is that hybrid enterprise as a whole, so everything from nonprofits to munis and co-ops, are competitive yardsticks. They can demonstrate to us when the industry is performing well or not performing well by providing transparency in how these systems operate. So for example, the investor-owned utilities will not tell you that their margins are 20 to 25%. One of the things that one of the major telco providers told a conference in California that I went to is they said that in order to get fiber to 1 mile per 1 mile of line in California, it would cost $300,000. Saying it's just not price competitive to do that. You go to Ann's Electric Co-op, they're able to operate this on a margin of 1 to 8%, and their cost per mile of line is $15,000 to $30,000. They said, I have no idea where that investor-owned utility is getting those figures. That is way inflated. Part of the reason why they're able to get their materials so cheaply is because they're able to leverage these supply co-ops that the electric co-ops own collectively. I believe there's 9 around the United States. So they pool the purchasing power, they buy the fiber optic broadband infrastructure, and they lower the cost on that, on those materials. Right now in South Carolina, by the way, the South Carolina co-ops got their electricity up and running before Duke Energy. And they did that because they have a supply cooperative called CS. And CS holds all this infrastructure back. So once a natural disaster comes through, the electric cooperatives are able to deploy that infrastructure right away. Really cool stuff. Also, hybrid enterprise and co-ops are able to serve as accountability birch branches. So we can look at maybe regulating some of these investor-owned utilities as well. Just as the investor-owned utilities back in the day were providing telephone in rural areas, we can have regulation that tells them to go out into rural areas as well. Co-ops reveal that profitability is not the issue. You can set these systems up and they will be profitable, just not 20 to 25% profitable. So policymakers absolutely have effective opportunities and venues and approaches in order to meet the last mile needs of our rural communities. Also, when you start peering into the electric co-ops, they provide all kinds of innovative approaches to how we can go out and deploy broadband. So they demonstrate that by putting out broadband over existing utility systems, you can enhance the legacy utility systems. So this isn't just a matter of enhancing our electric grid, but we can also enhance our water utilities too. In Indiana, there's a phenomenal electric cooperative called 9-Star Connect. 9-Star Connect was just an electric utility. Then they merged with a telephone co-op. They became a broadband provider. And then they had a rural water problem. So they decided they would become a water provider too. So they are a 3-tiered utility provider in 9-Star outside of Indianapolis. For those of you that are interested in engaging with electric co-op, that's in proximity to you all. I highly recommend them. 9-Star is a fantastic co-op to work with. But the other thing too is that we can leverage existing utilities through what I call stacking. So you don't have to have an electric cooperative. If you have a municipal, if you have city right-of-ways, you can use that existing infrastructure in order to establish your broadband utility. And you can establish it as a cooperative, a municipal, a not-for-profit. There's no reason why we couldn't look at this various toolbox that's out there. And there's examples for all of these things. The one that's most written about in the news is the one in Chattanooga, absolutely astounding municipal broadband ISP. I could have swore I saw the other day where they're increasing their minimum speeds to 2 gigabit, which is astounding. Also, hybrid enterprise are brokers of various public good provision too. The thing is that what I want to emphasize is that by setting up a utility co-op in your community, you're not just getting a utility provider, you're getting an entity that can also help deliver on a number of other public goods. And we see this with the electric cooperatives providing a ton of economic development services. Carolina, they actually have an economic development agency called South Carolina Power Team that aggregates the economic development needs of the 20 electric cooperatives around the state. And with that, they've been able to have some big job creators come in, helping out local businesses and these sort of things. There's no reason why, through the creation of a broadband co-op system in Illinois, you couldn't leverage that to do a similar thing to help out with business development in your communities. So with that, if y'all want to, you can click on this QR code here and it could bring up the documentary I did about Anza Electric Cooperative. But I'll toss it back to Mike to facilitate a discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, Keith. If anybody's having trouble accessing the QR code because it's only partially visible, let us know and we'll make sure you get the URL. And or Keith, maybe, I don't know if there's any way you can reduce the size of that slide to maybe get the full QR code. There you go.
Okay.
That should make it.
Cool.
Well, and we'll start. We do have a couple of comments and questions that have come in the course of the presentation. We'll start with one from Jerry. He notes that their rural area is getting fiber to the small towns. They were told that they're going to these towns first and maybe later they would go to the rural homes a few years later. I'm unsure if I trust that they will blanket the unserved farms and homes that are not close to each other. Any experience with that?
Yeah, that's definitely something that needs to be overcome in this. So when Jerry asked this question, I presume that he's talking about the existing incumbent providers that laid down this middle mile that's going through the areas or around the areas. So that's my presumption here. And if Jerry would like to type and clarify if I'm incorrect, then please do. If you're in a region that does not have a public ISP of some kind, again, co-op, nonprofit, municipal, you're going to have to wait for the investor-owned or family-owned ISP to want to deliver. And that can be challenging. There's nothing regulatorily that's telling them they have to go out to those areas unless the federal government gets them fully classified as a regulated utility. It's something that they're going through right now. So that's one of the downsides to this. In California, one of the things that is an amazing innovation that I'm very proud of, we have a middle mile provider called Scenic, CENIC. And it's a nonprofit, state-founded nonprofit that provides middle mile backbone access to our universities, community colleges, libraries, municipalities. Historically, they hadn't gone into last mile or to the home. What they did is under the governor's investments, they created, I think, what was it called? I think Golden State Connect. And they're going out, expanding their reach. So they're going by virtually every rural community to make it easy for rural communities to plug in once they create their local ISPs. So what this means is that Scenic isn't there to meet that last mile need, but they're there to empower them and enhance the capacity for the community to do that. Again, this is a really big state in California, but this was a necessary investment by the government, which, by the way, is going to get paid back. It's not like it was a subsidy that's going to go out into the ether. Scenic's going to make the money back to the government in California. Investing in broadband is a good thing. And by investing in broadband, you can actually ask the whatever you create, whatever entity, to pay back to the taxpayers. They don't need subsidies in terms of free money, so to speak. The investor-owned utilities will tell you that they do. In fact, they have gotten over $100 billion in free money. But there's really cool ways that we could get the policy dollars out there and have them spent and used by these firms. I would love to see Illinois, Indiana invest a lot more in their middle mile to take care of this issue that Jerry's talking about. But until then, if there's no specific policy to grow those middle mile backbones, it's going to be very challenging to address what Jerry's talking about.
Yeah, and Jerry's noted that they were hoping that the Illinois BEAD program would bring the funding to remove those unserved areas.
And that would absolutely have to be written into the contracts. The investor-owned utilities in this space typically do what's called it's a classic technique called cream skimming, where they go those high margin areas. What needs to happen is the money needs to direct them to go to low margin areas first. So we're guaranteed they will be served. And then there's no doubt the investor owned utilities will go in and fill in the remaining areas.
And an interesting observation from Senator Rachel Ventura from the 43rd District. She notes, what if we can't get other state legislators to see the need for this, or even to see the vision of how government can be a leader in this?
Senator, I really appreciate that question. This is where understanding how the electric co-ops are structured comes into play. The electric cooperatives can absolutely get involved in this. The electric cooperatives don't need the force of state government or federal government in order to start investing. There's a number of examples of electric cooperatives that have provided for broadband in their areas without subsidy even. South Carolina, there's this wonderful electric cooperative called Tri-County. They weren't waiting on the federal government dollars. Now, they applied for them, but they went ahead and they started building out the system anyway, seeing that the numbers will pencil out. What this is to say is that the electric cooperatives have capacity in Illinois to deliver. They have access to capital and they have access to knowledge. In terms of capital, they have some major groups that could provide the monies. Obviously, there's USDA Rural Utility Service, but then they have two big banks themselves that are owned by the co-ops. One's called, here's a mouthful, National Rural Utilities Cooperative Finance Corporation, NRUCFC, but they call it CFC for short. What I love what they do is they go out and they say, how many co-ops need to invest in broadband this year? 100 of them raise their hand, said, okay, we need $1 billion. They'll go out to Wall Street, do a bond offering. They'll get the money from Wall Street and come back to Main Street and give it out as debt to the electric co-ops. Really cool stuff. Then there's another group called CoBank, which is an ag and utilities cooperative bank. It's a government-sponsored enterprise, and they are capitalized at 165 billion. Sort of a great best-kept secret in many ways. It's to say that there's debt financing that's available too. So long as these electric cooperatives have a good business plan, they're likely able to get the resources needed to grow broadband in their communities. So, Senator, to your question, I hope I answered that, but it's to say, on one hand, yes, it'd be great if you had policy that would support this. But in the meantime, there's no reason why we couldn't put polite, kind pressure on the electric cooperatives and say, be the heroes in your community. Please deliver on this. There are examples to do this.
Well, that's actually probably a pretty good segue to what you'd noted earlier about the middle mile. Maybe this would be a good point for you to spend a little bit of time talking about the middle mile programs that you alluded to earlier.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that, Mike. The middle mile is this amazing sort of unspoken of element of the equation of getting broadband out there into their communities. I was really surprised to learn how many middle mile providers are around the United States. A number of them are largely investor owned. They're they're the transmission lines, I guess you could say, between our communities, to use an electric utility term. But in many states, they do have a nonprofit or a state provider that provides for the universities and the libraries and all this. And they've just been heavily underutilized. California decided to supercharge it. And what Scenic is doing is they're sort of doing this thing where they're almost like in for a penny, in for a pound. They're very happy to get their $3 billion investment from the state government through the governor. But what they're doing along the way is they're saying, now that we're in here, we're growing this and we're seeing there's this enormous appetite. What are some of the other gaps that we can fill? So they're actually looking at going into farm for ag tech. So we know that a lot of our rural areas, they have big, vast open areas. There's our problem with our rural communities, which can be very open and isolated. They have, compared to a metropolitan area, which could be anywhere from 30 to 50 households per mile of line, a rural community will have 4 to 7 households per mile of line. So your infrastructure costs do go up. But when you start going to farmland, especially, then the numbers get even harder to pencil out. So Scenic, what they're doing is they're saying, we've got our middle mile that's going across a lot of these farm fields. Let's see if we could tap into them. Let's see if we could put up cell phone towers. Let's see if we could do various wireless relays out here. But let's do this so we could do more ag automation, more ag tech, and help with digitizing our farmland, basically. Um, so once you put that state investment, that public investment into such entities, they become force multipliers that help us address other challenges of broadband provision. But not only that, now that they're building out and they are built out, it further enables the existing ISPs in some of our areas. So I mentioned Anza Electric Cooperative. Currently, they're going through an investor-owned utility to get their middle mile, and it's so-so service. They've got one connection point. So if that goes down, they lose all their broadband. When Scenic's investment comes through, I think they're going to have 3 connection points. So they're going to have redundancy. And as I mentioned, they're going to be able to do 1 gigabit up and down at $150 a month. There's some speculation conversation. They might be able to get as low as $35 a month, but I'm not holding them to that. With that too, once that middle mile investment comes through, it's really just upgrading the server infrastructure at either end. It's that fiber optic that's expensive and hard to lay down. Anza Electric Cooperative is excited because as their needs increase for more increased, faster broadband, they can then lean on Scenic to use their not-for-profit status to keep enhancing the services offered. So that's something that I really want to make people aware of. These middle mile providers are going to be a big part of how we get broadband out to these rural areas. Does that cover some of the topics, Mike?
Very well, very well. Please feel free to share if you have any more questions or comments that you'd like to toss in Keith's direction. We've got a few more minutes.
And Mike, and just interrupt me if folks ask some questions. But one of the things I do want to add is that the electric cooperative sector is absolutely amazing. I mean, just like any kind of group, I'll say the caveat: yes, of course, there's going to be some folks that don't want to play and this sort of thing. But they're democratically owned and governed firms. They're supposed to meet the needs of the local communities. Unlike the investor-owned utilities, where if you wanted to get access to the general managers or the CEOs, you have to go to New York City or San Francisco to meet these folks. The executives of these electric cooperatives are in our rural communities. When I did my book, I had met with this guy, Bruce. He was the CEO of Verendry Electric Co-op. And he said, I'm not protected from some boardroom. People can come up to me in my church, in the grocery store, and you better well expect that they will. So these general managers and executives know that they need to meet their community needs because they will be held accountable if they're not doing it. That said, a lot of them are. They're doing some absolutely remarkable things. And if they're not getting into broadband right now, I do want to caution folks against thinking anything nefarious. Often it's just they might not be hearing from their ratepayers. They might not know that there's a demand for them to be providing this. So what I'd encourage folks to do is humbly, kindly reach out to the executives and the board members of your local electric cooperatives. To the senator, I would recommend maybe a special convening with the state association and some of the leadership and talk about if you can create a statewide policy of all the electric cooperatives committing to various ways of providing broadband. And to the senator too, one of the other things I might add, some of the electric co-ops might say, we don't want to be the ones providing it. That's actually fine, so long as they enable the local creation by providing access to their right of ways and by collaborating on integration into the electric grid. That itself could be another great approach. Rappahannock Electric Co-op out of Virginia did something like that. And then the South Carolina Electric Cooperatives, same thing.
Sounds like a number of interesting possibilities for folks who are willing to explore them.
Absolutely. It's just a world of the possible here. And it's really just knowing that these players are out there and how to engage with them and how to talk to them. I think that people will find that they're very amenable and there's a lot of capacity to be had from engaging with them.
Well, and right on cue, Senator Ventura notes, it's complicated here. We've proposed some of that.
Well, Senator Ventura, I'd be more than happy to engage with you and your staff. If you want to reach out to me, I can talk to you about some of the approaches and how I think about these things.
Any other questions from the group assembled today? It's been a terrific presentation, Keith.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you, Nancy. Thank you, everybody. It's good to be virtually back in Illinois. And I hope this conversation catalyzes more conversations and it forces me to come back to Illinois to work with some folks. So thank you, everybody.
Tell you what, excuse me, on behalf of University of Illinois Extension, thank you, Keith, for the presentation today. And I do want to note that I think this is one example, but a really solid example of how the nationwide cooperative extension system delivers value to folks here in Illinois. So another one of those little heralded facets of extension and the services it provides. As I mentioned earlier, if you registered for the webinar, you will receive presentation materials in a follow-up email. If you aren't already receiving our email notices about these upcoming webinar offerings, please drop your email into the chat before you go, and we'll add you to the email list. And we'll also make sure that you get today's materials when they're sent out within the next day or so. I want to also highlight some of our upcoming webinar offerings. I'll note that our Connect Illinois Broadband series, appropriate to our topic today, in cooperation with the Illinois Office of Broadband, is continuing on Wednesdays at noon. To get the connections, just visit our website, go.illinois.edu/LGE. Also, want to invite you to check out the upcoming Corn Belt Ports update on Thursday, October 31st at 12 p.m. Just another example of the broad spectrum of topics that we cover in our webinars throughout the year. So again, for more information on upcoming offerings, please visit the website, go.illinois.edu/LGE. One more time. For information about upcoming programs, it also gives you access to our video archives of prior presentations, again, on the wide spectrum of topics that we've covered over the course of the years, community development as well as economic development topics, a terrific resource. And finally, thank you all for attending today's webinar. Appreciate your presence, appreciate your support. Have a great day, and we hope to see you back for future presentations. Bye-bye.
Mike, thank you, Keith.